Hello everybody, welcome to week 3 of the Digital Cinematography Masterclass. Really glad you can join us, and we're really excited to be bringing today's workshop to you with a big camera setup to showcase what's available with the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. Just want to remind everyone that what we're showcasing in terms of the equipment and the lenses. These are available digital arts loan equipment pieces that you can get from our library partners. So our library partners are the Blue Mountains Public Library, Collingwood Public Library, Wasaga Beach Public Library. And right now, the Blue Mountains Public Library and Wasaga Beach Public Library, you can access the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K, the exact one we're demoing here, if you have a library card. Then you also need to take a proficiency test. So it's online. You go to www.tbmcs.ca, take the test. It's online. You watch a few videos. It will give you a nice overview of the camera beyond what we're doing here. Then you can also email me. I put that up in the chat, tom@tbmcs.ca. Send me an email if you have any questions, or if you're wondering what anything about the equipment and taking it out. We have the equipment, the lights. We're using one of the lights here as well, the same type of light, the newer LED 480 LED light. So it's like a 480 watt equivalent light, super cool, and it's bicolor, so it can go daylight and tungsten, and we'll look at what that is today as well. So yeah, without any further ado, let's get right into it. So here's the overview of what we'll be looking at in terms of today's workshop, and we'll be looking at focus and using focus assist. What does that mean? We've looked at keeping things in focus, but we want to look at the actual options on the camera that allow us to make sure we're in focus. Exposure and light. So we'll really be talking today. We talked about angles, lenses last week, but today we're going to look more at exposure and light, dynamic range of the camera, over versus under exposure, lookup tables, LUTs, aka LUTs, color temperature and color balance. And there's some great workshops we have in the past on these as well, but this is kind of keeps it going. If you're going to watch these through these 4 sessions, you'll really become an expert in what this camera can do, and also in just the overall concepts of digital cinematography and what they mean and how they can work. So that's the really exciting part. So these are the main things. So today's gonna be really hands-on. So we're gonna get right into it. So let's just jump right into it here. In terms of again, questions, just send me an email if you have any questions, and if you want to go over anything. So we have this setup we've been working on. So we have this the globe, and we have the goat here on the side. And what's behind here is we basically have I have a window that's open behind, so we're kind of playing with some backlight, a little bit of side light we're going to add to this too, and then we're going to have to play with our exposure. So I've set it up right now for a pretty low light, just what's in the studio. There isn't any additional light, just that backlight and a little bit of the front light here that I'm just using for the actual our talk here. So I just have a little bit of light here, and that's probably going back in here. You can see kind of the goat and globe behind me. So we have this is our setup, and then we have some great angles today, so I'll be able to kind of show you what the setup is, how we're working on that setup, and then close-ups of the camera as well, so you can really see the menus and go from there. And we even have the side here, so you can see the lens, what we're doing with focusing, and the f-stops or t-stops, and we'll be talking about that in terms of exposure and getting the right type of exposure. So okay, so let's start up. So we got this. I'm not adding any extra light on it now, but what we'll do is we're gonna just put a little bit of a light here on the side. So I'm just gonna get up here, got to kind of squeeze through here. Got, like I said, I got a bunch of cameras, so I just gotta make myself fit in here. So what we'll do is, in terms of setting this up, so you can see I got that far back window is open. Usually that's a blackout curtain, and I don't have any kind of light going there. Then I'm going to just put a little bit of, here's our newer LED light here. It's kind of covered by this camera here, but there's just this little light here. So I'm just going to bring it up a touch so we can see the light and what it's doing. So that you should be able to see it now. So this is a newer LED light, and I'm just going to turn it on just with the adapter here. And like I said, it's bicolor, so we can make it totally a daylight, or we can, and it's dimmable. So you can see that's off, that's totally on. So we're just gonna leave it on about 60%. And we're set up for daylight, so we're going to just keep it in that manner right now. So now let's see what that looks like. So we kind of saw that before. Look, it's getting a little bit what is basically, it's starting to get a little bit overexposed, right? So, what does that mean? And how can we look at what exposure is, right? So before we get into that, let's look at focus. So right now, so that's just a bit overexposed. So I'm just going to bring it down so we can really see our focus. So here's a shot. It's in focus. And what you're seeing is the focus shot. How do we know that it's in focus? We have this great tool called Focus Assist. And there's this little bit of a red outline here. And I'm just going to make it, so there it is without, and there it is with. Right? So it's really subtle. But that Focus Assist is something we can go to our menu, and I'm going to go to Monitor, and you'll see it's right here. There's a little button that says Focus Assist. That could be on or off. And LCD, so now I'm going to go to the HDMI. I'm just going to turn it on there so you can actually see the feed with the Focus Assist. And I'm going to put the zebra on too, and we'll get into that after. So here's the Focus Assist. Let me just cut right to the camera here. So now you can see the red in the feed. See, the red's gone. See that red just around the globe, right? That red peaking color is telling me that the subject is in focus. What's in focus, what's out of focus. So you're not just using your eye, but you're using that Focus Assist, and that can really help. So if you're moving around really quickly, you might need to, move around quickly. How can you move around with the camera and keep everything in focus? Right, so that could always be a bit of an issue. Like, how do you keep everything in focus? And that's the key. That we can then know that we can have things in focus. So, in terms of other options here, so Focus Assist on or off. I'm just going to go over here to both, and there's also when you go to both. So we have the LCD, so that's determining what monitor levels we have right on this LCD screen. HDMI is determining what the feed is seeing through the HDMI cable. In this case, what you guys are seeing through this webinar. And then we can also look at both, and both gives us some extra fun things. So Focus Assist, I like to put colored lines. Focus color, you can change it. So let's say you're shooting something that's red. It'll be hard to see if it's in focus if it's red. So we can change it to red. I can change it to green. So here it is now in green. So here we just cut to that. See, now it's a green highlight. And that works really nice too, to be able to see what's there, right? So that's green. And then I can also do blue. So there it is in blue. So it's a fantastic tool, and it really lets us quickly change everything. Now I can also go to high. So Focus Assist level, and check this out. Now it's going to be, see, like you can see a lot more. So we can go low, medium, high. So it kind of depends on what you're comfortable with. I like to be in the medium. But just for demonstration purposes, let's go to high. And it can be white, and it can be black, depending again if something like that. But I like red because it really helps that pop out. So look again, if I'm changing the focus, so you can see the focus is shifting. What's in focus, right? So the background, and slowly that whole globe. And you can see the goat's feet. Right, so lets me really see the depth of field we talked about last week and exactly what's in focus. So it's a really, really great tool, and I love working with it in that kind of capacity. Okay, so now while we're on this menu, let's look at another thing. So how do we determine what our focus is? So I like to use what's called the zebra levels and a combination of the histogram to figure out what's truly in focus. And that lets me kind of determine, okay, what's the optimum kind of exposure area. So I always like to say what you see is what you get. So, if you see something that looks really blown out, it's blown out. If you can't see the image, it's too dark and underexposed, right? So really what you see, if it's looking nice, there's a good amount of contrast, it's kind of what you're looking for, that's, you're in the right kind of sweet spot of getting that imagery, right? So that's really cool. So how do we access that? So let's go over here. I'm going to go to the HDMI, and we have something here called zebra. And that zebra will let me determine if things are in exposure range or out of exposure range. So let's cut back to our shot here. So you can see we have the Focus Assist, And we also have and that's, now I've opened it all the way up. So I've done this to open it all the way up. And, that's what it looks like right there. So here's the shot, right? So I'm totally opened up to 1.5, right? So that's like opened up all the way there. I'm just gonna change this exposure a touch. So see, here's a good example of just making things a bit darker so that we can see it. So it's getting a little bit overexposed. So see that 1.5? So we're open all the way. That's what this looks like. So you can see this is blown out. And the zebra, those little stripes you see, are really telling me that it's blown out as well. So you can see right here, this kind of zebra here, there's a little bit of zebra here, and it kind of moves, and it's this line. And I put it at 100%, and that tells me that it's at, the 100% value that's out of the exposure range, if you will, or 100% brightness. It's maxing out. Some people like to work in 95% so that they're always a little bit underexposed, but I like to just know that, okay, that's the 100%, and then I can reduce it from there. So how do we get to that? So let's have a look here. So we go to the menu, I turn on the zebra, and we want this on our LCD as well. So you can see I have the zebra like so. I'm gonna go over here, oops, to both. And here's our peak, zebra levels 100%. Right, so that's perfect. Okay, so zebra, and then you see exactly like that. Now watch how I can adjust this to go from overexposed. I'm just gonna start closing on the aperture. So see it, the zebra goes away when it starts to get into the right kind of exposure level. You can see it's still there on the globe, and here it's gone. And you can truly see that, around this point, so we got the zebra, and then we're going down. Around that point, that's a pretty nice exposure range. And then the last step is we have this great tool called the histogram, which is down here in this bottom corner. If you ever miss this menu, there's a way to, if you can clear it. Sometimes this happens. Then just swipe up with your finger, and it comes back on. So that's just if you're ever missing the histogram, that's where it's gone. You can just swipe down, swipe up. It's a touch screen. Now the histogram here, it's telling me there's a lot of, this is basically from the darks, the blackest color range, to the brightest white, like 100%. So like 0 to 100%, if you will, of light or exposure. Histogram is great because it tells me that we have a lot of rich darks in this area, in this frame, and we don't have anything that's totally overexposing. Now let's go back to that overexposing thing. Look at that. Everything shifts over, and you can see there's this little spike here at the end, right? So although we're not drastically overexposing, it still is spiking in relation to that. Now I'm going to just change the ISO. We're going to go up to 1250, so we can really see something that's totally overexposing. Now look at that. There's nothing in the mid-range here at all, and this is just spiked all the way up. So that's basically saying 100%, it's all blown out. So this is unusable. Now watch here, I'm just going all the way down to like, and you can look at the histogram. So from unusable to, we get rid of that, see, we want get rid of that peak at the 100%, we don't want any of it. See, and right when we're about here, you can see that the zebra goes away, and then we're in a pretty good exposure range, like so. Right, so that's the whole idea, getting rid of that zebra line and then playing with the exposure like that. And that's how simple it is to get into practicing proper exposure for your imagery. So we're looking at the zebra, 100%, those zebra lines, we don't want to see the zebra lines, and then the histogram as well. Now there's going to be exceptions, and I'm hoping, weather permitting, that next week we can do a little bit of exterior cinematography to kind of end our 4-week session here. And exteriors, it's harder because you will have sometimes that really bright sunlight, and they're going to be a little bit of a blown out thing. So in terms of what that means when things are blown out, there's something called a dynamic range. So we can control things again with light, with our exposure, right? So you can see right now, so I'm at ISO 1250. I've gone down to to 5.6 to reduce the exposure, right? So that's fantastic. So I've reduced it again. So this would be the overexposed 1.5, and then I'm bringing it down to about I think about 8 gets me into a nice exposure. So you can see that's how many stops there are. I have to bring it down to get it into proper exposure. But sometimes if you're outside, the dynamic range might be more than that. So these cameras have what's called 13 stops of dynamic range. That means it can handle from the darkest point to the brightest point, 13 stops. What are the stops? So the stops are essentially identified by these numbers, 5.6 to 8, 8 to 11, 11 to 16, 16 to 22. So within this ring, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, we have 9 plus a few more range stop points of range of exposure. So that's why we're able to still see something that's pretty bright in the image, but also something that's really, really dark. And that's the dynamic range. Different cameras will have different dynamic range. And luckily, this Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera 4K has 13 stops, approximately. 12 to 13, they say. Now, that means the darkest point to the brightest point can have that kind of range, right? But if I totally overexpose it, you can still see that it can handle it a bit, right? But anything that's that glowing is basically ruined, and it's really impossible to do too much in post if that is your subject. So this is where the dynamic range is really important. Figuring out, okay, what do I need to expose the subject, and what's can still be seen in the background. So you can see in the shadows, we can still see some nice details. And in the subject range, there's still the subject, the goat, is clean. We can see the shadows in the fur. And that tells me that I'm not overexposing. That's why I use that as a figure. It's not just something that's a fun toy, but it actually, that white fur gives me a really good access point to figure out what is exposing properly, what's not exposing properly, and how that works. Right? So again, that's really key. So you can see here, F8. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring down the ISO. So let's go back down to 400. Okay, so now you can see it's really dark. It's really dark. So what we can do here is we can say, we can keep it at, right now I have it at 8, right? So it's totally at a T-stop here of 8. I'll mention T-stops and F-stops. So F-stops are in photography. T-stops are usually cinema based. So the cine lenses that we have in our kits are T-stop based. That means it deals with the loss of light that occurs through the lens traveling through the glass. Whereas an f-stop in photography doesn't account for that partial loss. So a true T is almost like, I like to call it a true stop versus an f-stop that is just a approximation of a stop. So in cinema lenses, we have that true stop. So look at this. So we have, so two things we can do here. So I'm at 5.6. Now what I can do is I can open up the aperture to get the right amount of exposure. So again, all the way open, 1.5, and then I start to get, and what we want to do is have that detail in the fur that I can just see the shadow, so it's not blown out. So you want to always make sure a white area is not totally blown out. Now the table has a nice rich white light on it that's still not totally blowing out. Now that would be kind of the exception. Let's say the sun was a little bit brighter there. It could be possible that that could be a slightly blown out. Highlights such as sunlight and a little bit of shafts of light that aren't your actual subject can be quite effective to use as a blown out area. So look at the back window there. You can't really see details out of it, and that's because the sun's blowing out with that camera's particular exposure, which is 3.1, a T-stop of 3.1. You can see also this window is blowing out a bit. You can't see all the details. So that's that kind of dynamic range. There's so much dynamic range from the darkest here to the brightest. We're out of those 13 stops of dynamic range. But if we reduced the light or increased the light in here to try to match that, we can get into the same kind of dynamic range. And that's kind of that fun part of getting within that dynamic range. But generally, a lot of times windows will see blown out in digital cinematography. And especially in indie filmmaking, it's hard to get everything to balance, bring enough light in here, have reduce the light outside. Two things we can do, just some fun tips and tricks here. We can put what's called an ND, neutral density. You can actually buy gel sheets. Put that on the window, and then it's like tinting the window, and then the exposure will be great. It will match inside and outside. Or we can increase the light in here so that we can match the amount of light there, but that would make it very, very bright in here, potentially uncomfortable for me as a subject in my eyes. And that, or we can also try to flag the light outside. So we can put some sort of a reflector on top, and try to eliminate the amount of sunlight that's coming through that. So those are kind of some of the options there. So that's kind of just a little aside there on how that would work. Okay, so I've stopped down to 2.8 and 400. So that's one way we can do that, right? So now let's say we're all the way, we're down to like ISO 100. I'm trying to open up all the way here. So I'm at 1.5, and I'm really dark. So I've opened it up, all the way here, and the image is still a little bit darker looking, but you can see it's not too bad. It's actually pretty decent. And that's the cool thing about these lenses is they're really super speeds. Okay, so what I can do here is I can then start to increase my light. So now I'm just increasing the light to go 100%. And you can see that's just kind of adding, and I'm going to put a little bit of the tungsten in there as well. So, and that's just, see, it's adding just enough extra exposure to make it really nice looking, versus before it was just a touch dark. And you can see there's a little bit of zebra glow, right? But as long as my fur is pretty good, I think that's pretty decent. So that fur looks really nice. There's a little bit of reflection here, a little bit of overexposure on the table. But I like that because that's telling me that there's a big source, the window in the background. And here there's a bit of reflection from the globe. So you can see just see that light, by reducing it, it's getting rid of that. It gets rid of that reflection. So we could potentially look at reducing that a bit. But again, I don't mind that highlight on the globe, highlight on the table. I think that's a pretty interesting shot. So that gives us that dynamic range and within the exposure area. So again, this is the thing where we're at ISO 100. Here we are now, ISO 100, and our histogram's pretty nice looking. We have a little bit of the zebra buzzing here on the globe and on the table, which isn't bad. And then we have all our stop is open up. So this is, we're really, that's pretty amazing at 100, and to be getting a really nice image in a pretty low light situation. So again, this is our situation. It's not very bright in here in the studio. So that camera's at ISO 800 just to give me this bright looking room. So look at that, the ability of what this Blackmagic camera can do here in this low light. So now let's switch it up, and we're gonna just go to ISO, let's go up. So every time we go up from like 100 to 200, we're adding a full stop extra of exposure, which is just to note that we go from 100 to 200, 200 to 400, 400 to 800. We're adding one full stop each time. And then in between, you'll notice that it goes 100, 125, that's a third of a stop, 160, a third of a stop, and then that's a full stop extra. So that's why it's broken down in that way. Again, a nice FYI for how this camera system works. Okay, so now we've gone to 200, and you can see we're getting just a little bit of a nicer image, and it's behaving a little bit differently. So, our range is a little bit different. Here, let's go right to the camera. So look at that. So now we're at still open up. So I'm just going to close it down a bit. And, sometimes by the lens characteristics can be different too. So now I'm at 2.8. So I've gone like that whole stop brighter in light, and then I can also stop down the lens. But we get this kind of different characteristic. And this is the fun part. The lens will have different characteristics as well. So open up to slightly closed, it will give you a different kind of dynamic range. Usually open up it's going to struggle a little bit with blown out highlights and things. And now you can see it's actually exposing quite nice. So this is where you kind of start to look at what's the sweet spot. So about 2.8 is really the kind of sweet spot range here instead of being totally open. So as you can see, we're here, 2 to 2.8 is kind of a nice range, but the 1.5 I found was a little bit too, it was giving us a little bit too much of a blown out range there. Right, so just of a note of what that would look like, right? So again, so we have the 2.2 to 2.8 is, that 2.8 is a really nice sweet spot on the lens here, where it's giving me nice exposure, less of the blown out area on the table. And you can see it's pretty even all the way through. And there's that shallow depth of field that we talked about last week. We're achieving a lot of things here. So I'm quite happy with how that looks. So remember, again, we can be working with the ISO, right? So our light sensitivity sensor, we have our exposure through the lens, so the t-stops. And then we also have our light. How much light are we adding? So this affects exposure. The lens, how much light we're letting in affects the exposure. And then how much light sensitivity on the sensor affects exposure. So those are those three elements. Next week, we're going to look at filtration, which is the fourth element, where we can put ND filters and different types of filters on the lenses as well. And that will give us something different. So this is pretty cool. So that's looking nice. So that's the over versus underexposure. So again, here this is pretty nice. Here we're overexposing. Okay, and now let's look at the other extreme. If we start to underexpose, that is very underexposed. Now, the good thing is we can probably boost it a bit, but we're going to be missing all those details in the background. By those details, you can see even from this kind of side angle of the LCD panel, all of this is going to be really dark and just it's hard to get anything out of that. But this could work well. Let's, for example, say if we're trying to shoot something as a night scene. So that could work quite well. It could be, okay, this is nighttime. Doesn't it look more like nighttime than it does daytime now, right? So that's a pretty cool way to think about it. Are we at nighttime now, right? So underexposing that's to the extreme where we're really trying to creatively make it look like something. Okay, so again, overexposed, here's like our proper exposure that we determined at 2.8. Right, so we're at 2.8 there. That's our proper exposure. You can see that lines up with the exposure range, 2.8. And on this side is our focus. So I should mention that too. When we're focusing, that's where we change the focus. Right, so it's telling us that what's in focus. This is the cool part. It tells us right here that we're in focus at about 1 meter away from the lens. That's what's lining up. So that's really cool. All right, so you can always kind of look at that. It's giving you the actual like science behind how far the lens is to the subject, right? So that about just over 1 meter, and it's really accurate. Like within here, if you can see, this camera is really just 1 meter away. One arm's length is about 1 meter for me here. So it's right on in terms of where that exposure is. So that's another thing I wanted to mention. Just here as our focus, it always tells us what distance we're focused at. And then here's our exposure, right? Okay, so let's get back to this overexposure, underexposure. So if you want to underexpose a little bit, you can always underexpose like 1 or 2 stops. So now we're at 4. So that looks pretty cool. That's still not bad. We could boost this up, but I would never really underexpose more than 1 full stop maximum. So here, going back to the image, you can still see enough details in the background. We can boost this in post-processing, post-production, color grading in Blackmagic DaVinci Resolve software and color grading. We could boost it up that 1 stop, still bring those details in. But you can see if we start to go 2 stops under, now we're at 5.6. So there we go, we went from 4 to 5.6. Once we go 2 stops under, you can see those details are really getting lost. That's kind of the danger zone. So I would never really go more than that. But I do like to usually go between one stop. So here's our 2.8. So about a third of a stop or up to a full stop maximum isn't bad. It's a good way to underexpose a little bit, because with digital cinematography, if you underexpose a bit, you can always boost it a bit. But I'd always rather go just 1/3 stop underexposed than to be a little bit overexposed. Because in the post, you can always bring things up. It's a lot harder to bring things down. So again, if our goat here is blown out like so, there's no detail in the fur, I cannot rescue that. That blown out material cannot be rescued in post-production. Anything with the zebra will stay blown out. You can't recover details with anything that's beyond that 100% zebra, right? So just to know that that'll be glowing and blown out, and that's really cool. So if you think about like films like Casino, they really have that kind of blown out area, right? Like in something like the film Casino, it has those really cool like blown out imagery, and that lets us have those kind of blown out areas within the image, right? Like this. That's really neat, right? So that can give that. But you can see we don't want the subject blown out. So this is the thing. If you're filming this goat with the fur, you have to really make sure it's in a good exposure range and that it's not getting blown out, because we won't be able to salvage any kind of fur details. This is why usually it's highly recommended that if you have your cast, depending on what they're wearing, that for them to not wear something that's like white, because that can definitely blow out, and that could be an issue, right, in terms of blowing out and making that work, right? So that can be definitely become an issue. So just something to think about in terms of how that can work, and will it work? Really important considerations. Okay, so now in terms of what we're looking at and how we're looking at things. The next thing I wanted to look at are the lookup tables. So just what that means and how that works. So let's go over here to the menu, and when I hit that's that menu button there on the side. Again, monitor, we have display 3D LUT. LUT stands for lookup table. So in the presets, all the way over here, LUTs, we go pocket 4K film to extended video. That's the only one you really need to worry about. That goes from the 4K film mode to the extended video mode to show you what it will look like when you bring it into editing, or if you have a bit of a color grade on it. So let's look at the difference between turning that LUT on or off. So back to monitor, I'm going to go to the HDMI here, display LUT, and you just press it and you can turn it off or on. So let's have a look at what that looks like. So here it is with the LUT, the lookup table displayed. Here it is off. So you see the difference? We're seeing all that color. So now it looks like raw type negative. And that's the really interesting part. So about that, it's kind of a raw looking negative, and that's what is the range now versus when it's on. So there we go. That's totally, it's on. You see all the color in the lookup table, and then here you see it without. Okay? So the on or off. So I like to leave the lookup table on when I'm filming, so I can get an idea of what that color is going to look like at the end product. But for referencing, it's really great to just see it without. So you can see that raw image. And again, you'll be able to see what's blown out or not. And it gives you a little bit, it's kind of flatter looking. That's what it looks like in kind of that raw idea. So just like photography, this digital cinematography camera, this digital cinema camera has the ability to shoot in that raw type mode without all the color information. But it's there as metadata, and then you add it in after if you wish, how much you want to build on it. And we have some great workshops on the coming up, and also already on our YouTube channel about color grading for video using Blackmagic DaVinci Resolve. So that could be a great thing to use, right? So again, so I always leave it on just to know kind of what I'm going to see what it looks like after, but it is always nice to go back and forth to see, okay, this is what my raw negative looks like, if you will, of the image. So that's the whole idea between the LUTs, turning them on or off. So once again, right here on the menu, display 3D LUT on or off like that. So that's how that would work. Okay, so now let's look at one final thing we want to look at today, and that is the color temperature and color balance aspect. So the color temperature and color balance is, just something that we work on in terms of what the camera can do, or what kind of color temperature settings. To access these, we just go up here and it's called white balance. So it's WB. I press this. It's going to give me, so that went to the wrong, it's going to give me a bunch of presets. You'll probably be familiar with these in terms of exposure, like using photography cameras and things like that. So if you go to, this one is a sunlight, meaning that's daylight, or 5600 degree Kelvin. We go to the tungsten one, and that's meaning that it's looking for a yellowish light, 3200 degrees Kelvin. There's a fluorescent light, there's a shade, like house shade. There's also a cloudy day. And then you can do custom white balance, you can do auto white balance. And that lets you click on something, it's gonna auto, and now it's saying that in here, it's 4400 degrees Kelvin. So it's in between tungsten and daylight to get us that right kind of color temperature. So here's our white balance set at daylight. And let's just have a look at what happens if we're changing our light. So I'm gonna go over here and just change this light right up here and look at what does it do when I'm changing the light. So right now I have it on the daylight light. Okay, I'm gonna turn the light off and watch this. Now I'm gonna go all tungsten. Look how much warmth that's put in. So that's in the daylight setting. If I'm using tungsten, it makes it look yellow. Now I'm going to go to the camera, and instead of that, I'm going to change it to tungsten. And let's go back here. And now you can see the daylight from the window in the background is very blue, but the yellow is no longer looking yellow. It looks like it's correct. So this way, with daylight, right? So we've set up daylight as our window, but we're color balanced at 3200 degrees Kelvin. All the daylight comes in blue, and our main subject is coming in at the correct color temperature. So this gives us the look as if we're here in the nighttime. So that's a really cool trick we can do. So let's go back here. So now it's very yellow. Now it looks like we're at a fireplace versus the tungsten one, which makes it look like nighttime. But notice the subject is not well lit here because it's very yellow in the daylight setting. But in the tungsten, the subject looks pretty good, but that light from the window now looks like moonlight, very blue. Okay, so let's go back here to and watch this. Now I'm going to turn that light off. I'm going to just turn the daylight on. And you can see now that subject, again, is properly exposed and the daylight is properly exposed. So the light plus the camera setting is equal and matched. That gives us a matching source. Mismatch gives us different things, like a yellow subject or a blue window. So that's the really fun thing about color grading and how that, or color temperature, color balance and color temperature. And then again, we can do that auto white balance. So basically you just hit this button and the subject's centered, and I just go update white balance, and it's saying it's 4600, 4400, last time 4600 now. And this gives us kind of a neutralized, so that it's a little bit in between. The daylight's a little bit bluer, but the subject is well balanced off. And I'm gonna put a little bit of yellow, switch that up, put a little bit of yellow here. And we're gonna do that again. So back here, hit on the white balance, auto white balance, and wherever that square is, that's kind of its target area. update white balance, and now we're at about 4,000. So that's neutralizing the yellow, making the subject look pretty good, but there's a tint of blue in the back. And this is kind of a compromise that we're in between the two color temperatures, daylight and tungsten, right? So it's a really fun tool to play with and use. You can also just slide through. So if I hit white balance, I can slide through and find kind of what I like in terms of the image. So how we did that again, if I go right here, I hit custom white balance, and then I can just slide through to find, where I kind of like it. And there's no rule to what you want. It's what are you trying to achieve. So if I want, like the scene to be kind of blue, very blue, it could be very blue. I could be like kind of in between, and I can go to the super warm side. Or I can go here where it's maybe kind of greenish in some spots. And then here again, we're going to kind of that blue, the blue spot there, right? We can go very blue and very warm and somewhere in between, right? So that's the fun part. So, when starting off, I always recommend go with the main presets, and then you can work from customizing it from there. Now, again, the beauty of this is that white balance and shooting in Blackmagic RAW or B-RAW mode on these cameras, you can change the color temperature later. So it's just like a negative, but it's not the color information isn't baked into the camera or the data. So that allows you to then change things a bit later on, which is a really cool and fun way to do it, that we can shoot like this, and then we can change the color temperature or modify it. Because remember, at the end of the day, that's all this color information. Okay, and just for fun, let's turn off the LUT. So now we see this kind of more raw flat mode. And watch as I change the color temperature in this flat mode. It's more subtle. And that's what you got to remember, is that in the negative, it's really subtle, that color changes, the blues and so on. Right? So it's less affecting the image than when we have that whole lookup table on. And back to the, turn that lookup table on here again. And there we go. Okay, so just to recap again, we have we want to play with, always work with our exposure. We want to make sure that we're exposing, that we're not overexposed here, and then we're not totally in the dark area. It's always easier to boost. So we've been saying we can underexpose a third of a stop or so. So again, here's our stops. We can always underexpose. So 2.8, I can go all the way to full stop to 4 if I really want to, bring it up later. So that's kind of the best practices guide. We use the zebra mode to figure out if we're overexposing. So we turn the zebra on, and then we're able to see those zebra lines, and then we know we're overexposed. We close the aperture down till we don't see the zebra line, and then we know that we're good. And also we don't want to see any kind of clipping in the histogram. So that's how we can really get into our exposure. Next, the dynamic range. We want to make sure that if something's blown out, it's not our subject. It could be windows, if anything. And then we're staying within those 13 stops of dynamic range. Then there's the over versus underexposure. So definitely always underexpose a touch versus overexposure, because you can always boost it, like we just talked about, a third of a stop to a full stop. The lookup tables, we can turn those on or off right here in the menu under monitor, and then we can just simply turn them on or off right there. Same with the zebra. And then we also have our focus assist, and that was allowing us to specifically see what's in focus or what's not in focus. So in this case, we see it's in focus, and then that red, glowing red part is showing that it's in focus. Then our color temperatures, we can adjust the color temperature by simply hitting the white balance up here, going to presets, customizing it, or doing the auto white balance. We can play with different ranges of color temperatures. So if we say there's, using the tungsten mode with daylight windows, it makes it blue, and we go on from there. So that's really exciting ways to look at these and make them all work. Perfect. Okay, so like I said, next week we're going to be looking at filtrations, filters, neutral density filters, some other filters, and what that means. and hoping if the weather's good that we might be able to do a little bit outside or at least through the windows, and that will go from there. So again, if you have any questions, please send me an email. I have the tom@tbmcs.ca email address. Go to our website, www.tbmcs.ca, so you can check out, there's an online proficiency test, so you can take this camera out if you're a member of the Blue Mountains Public Library or Wasaga Beach Public Library. Take it out, it's an amazing tool, lenses, you can practice all this stuff that we talked about and rewatch these. You can rewatch this when we're done on this Vimeo link. It's going to be archived, and then we post these a little bit later once each masterclass is done to our YouTube channel as well. So it's going to stay archived there as well. So definitely check that all out. So yeah, thanks again for joining us. We just want to thank all our partners in making this happen. Canada Council for the Arts. Then we have our library partners, Blue Mountains Public Library, Collingwood Public Library, and the Wasaga Beach Public Library. Just seeing if there's any questions here. And just a question about the dynamic range. So yeah, good question. The 13 stops of dynamic range really specifically is just that sensor range. It's not a setting you can do. And that's just the rough testing idea of what the dynamic range is. Some people say it's less, 12, 11. The point is that you have that whole lens range of exposure from the darkest to the brightest, but you want to always make sure that you were talking about from where the brightest is to all the way to the darkest, that we'll see that amount of stops of dynamic range. But overexposure is still overexposure, right? So that's why you can go only so high, but the sensor can't handle that super bright area where it starts to blow out. So that's why we have to look at that overexposure and underexposure. Thank everyone for joining us. So again, this was Exploring Focus, Exposure, and Color. Thanks for joining us, and I'll see you guys next week for week 4.